Let me screen share. Okay, so I know most of you have had intro psych in here and you have probably covered this stuff before, but we're going to go and launch into the learning perspective because a lot of times understanding the learning perspective is going to help us change individuals' behaviors. And I'll walk through this, but if you've got questions, let me know, but you all need to get this stuff because this stuff that we're covering today, it's going to keep building and building all throughout the semester. Can you all see where it's converting my previous recording? Can you see that? I'm moving it around right now. Good, okay. It's annoying me, but I just want to make sure it's not annoying you. Okay, so from the learning perspective is the idea that all of our behavior or lack of behavior, it's all learned or conditioned, okay? And it's the idea that the environment is impacting and conditioning our behavior depending on what the environment is. So I like to use an example. Imagine what your behavior is like when you're socializing with your friends or when you're at a party and you're having fun. That behavior may be very different than, say, your behavior back in the old days when we were in a classroom, or that may be very different behavior than, let's say, when you're with your family and you go to church or you go to temple. The environment oftentimes dictates a certain kind of behavior, okay? We're even, with some of the writing that's going on right now, there's certain types of behavior that tend to get unleashed in an environment where people are together in a crowd and they're really upset about something that they're protesting against or something that's going on, as an example. So within behaviorism, there are two types of conditioning. We're going to cover both of these today: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And so this is my sweet Leo. He's prettier than Pavlov's dogs, but let's talk about what happened in Pavlov's experience. Now, I think what I need to do, I'm going to stop share here for a second, and I'm going to see if there's a way that I can draw. Because I want to draw. Why is it not giving me an option to draw? It is not. All right, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here and let's see if I can walk you all through this. Oh, here we go. Here's what I want. Okay. So we're going to do unconditional, sorry, this is not very pretty, unconditional stimulus that creates an unconditional response. Okay, and then we're going to do a conditioned stimulus. What did Pavlov use when he was working with his dogs?
Food.
A bell.
A bell.
Yeah. That's a straight line, but it looks crooked. Okay, so I want us to think through this. Okay, if I had my dog Leo in here and I had him sitting on the other side of the room and I dinged a bell, do you think my dog would start salivating and start slobbering?
Probably not.
No. What would be the unconditional response to dinging a bell for a dog? Here's dog. Dog's facing this way. Bell just gets dinged back here.
He's just going to look in that direction.
Yeah, he's going to orient, right? He's going to be like, what's that, right? Yeah, he's heard it, so he's going to orient towards it. He may come trotting over and see what's going on. If it's like the sound, if the bell is so loud like it's a thunderclap, some dogs are really scared of thunder. In that case, it might be hearing the thunderclap and then going and hiding, or I've got some friends whose dogs get in their bathtub when it's thundering, that type of thing. But yeah, okay, so I think you all know that a bell, it doesn't make sense that the unconditional response to a bell would be salivation. So here's Pavlov. And keep in mind, Pavlov was not a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist, and he was studying digestion, okay? He wanted to understand how we as mammals, we take food in, the waste comes out in a very different way, how we digest the food and make use of the nutrients in the food. So he's got all these dogs in the lab, and the first thing he and his lab assistants would do every morning is they would come in and feed the dogs. If you're going to study digestion, it makes sense you feed them, and then you watch the digestion happen. And so they had the dogs, they had little tubes in their mouths collecting saliva. They had little tubes in their stomachs collecting acid from their stomachs. And what they would do is what they found to be interesting is they would come in, turn the lights on, get ready to start the day. Even before they fed the dogs would start salivating. The physiological response was happening before the food was presented. So the unconditional stimulus here is food. Okay. And it would make sense that if we are presented with food, then we would have this response over here. I'm just put sal, but you know, salivation. Okay. Think about it this way. Like, let's say you're really, really hungry and your roommate comes in with a piping hot pizza and you could smell that pizza. Oh yeah, you're going to start salivating. And oh yeah, your tummy might start growling because it's like in anticipation of eating that yummy pizza, as an example. Okay. So Pavlov starts playing around with it. He's like, why are they digesting before we feed them? It would make sense that they would start digesting after we feed them. Maybe it's the time of day, or maybe it's something associated with it. So Pavlov starts, when they feed, they would place the food in front of the dog. He would ding a bell, okay? And then these two things are learned association. They're paired associations. Advertisers do this all the time. They show us commercials of beautiful people with beautiful products, like a really nice sports car and nice, cool music in the background. And it's like we're looking at these beautiful people with this cool music and this beautiful car, and we're making these associations between, oh, if I had that car, I would be, you know, going around with cool music playing on, that type of thing. Advertisers do all the time. Okay, so Pavlov starts dinging the bell when the food is presented, and then lo and behold, it became classically conditioned. He could ding the bell and the dogs would start salivating and their stomach acid would start coming out. Okay. Now, let's say that that's a nuisance. I don't know if any of you have, if people come and ring the doorbell in your home, and if you have a dog that likes to, you know, greet the people at the door, as soon as doorbell rings, dogs oftentimes are like, you know, they're over by the door. That would be an learned association. Let's say this bell's a nuisance, okay? You don't like it when somebody rings the doorbell and all the dogs are barking at this person at the door. What would you do? What would be the process of breaking this classically conditioned bond? Does anybody know the name? Extinction, okay? And what you would do is you would ding the bell, no food, ding the bell, no food, ding the bell, no food, ding the bell, no food. And eventually the dogs are going to stop reacting to the bell. They habituate or desensitize to the bell. Got it? Any questions here? So when we talk about a conditioned stimulus, we're talking about a learned stimulus that elicits now what would be a conditioned response. Whereas the food would be the instinctive or the unconditional stimulus that leads to an unconditional response of digestion. Questions? Okay, I'm going to give you a human example. Let me go back here. Okay, so many years ago, I was driving into ASU, and there was construction going on the road where I went through a light and then came around a blind turn, which is very common in Boone, went through the light, came around the blind turn, and lo and behold, because of construction, traffic was backed up. So I come around through the light, around the blind turn, and I have to hit my brakes really quickly to stop before I hit the van in front of me, okay? And then I see in my rear view mirror, what I think happened, it was this little old lady, and she came through the light, and then I think she saw traffic backed up, and I think she meant to hit her brake, but she hit her accelerator instead. And I saw her, so I'm, you know, there driving, I see her in my rear view mirror, and she's accelerating at me. And she hits me, I bounce off the van in front of me, I bounce back and forth a little bit, I'm fine. But she was not fine. She didn't have her safety belt on. She's this old woman, her airbag deployed, and there was smoke. I didn't realize they smoked, but I thought her car was on fire. So a bunch of us get out and we get this woman out and we call an ambulance because she's banged up. And again, now I know the airbags, when they deploy, they're smoky like, but that doesn't mean you're on fire. But we were scared. We got her out, got an ambulance. anyways, okay. And then because I had looked at her driver's license that day when I was interacting with police, I knew her name. So I violated HIPAA. I managed to track down her, I think it was her daughter-in-law, and called her that night just to make sure she was okay, because I was worried about her. So, okay. So when I got hit, I was tense because I saw in my rearview mirror that she was coming at me. So I had my safety belt on. I was nice and tense. So even though my car bounced, like there was no injury to my body. Okay, you got it? I wasn't hurt. There's no whiplash. But in the weeks that followed, I started getting neck and back problems. And it was like, maybe did I have whiplash? You know, like I wasn't hurting like right after the accident, but then I started hurting. It's like the pain was growing as time went on. But what I realized is I wasn't injured in that little bump. What was going on was I was driving around Boone after that, like, oh, we're the little old ladies that are going to come and get me. You know, like who's going to hit me next? And it was my muscle tension and the way that I had learned to be in that. I had classically conditioned that position based on that accident. That makes sense? And I was driving around like that. And then it finally occurred to me, like, it's no wonder I'm having neck and back pain. Look at what I'm doing. And I had to do some relaxation. I had to learn to kind of relax my body again when I was driving. Does that make some sense? So that one trial learning, that getting bumped back and forth, created that classical conditioning just in the way I held my body. And that's what was creating problems, not necessarily injury from the being hit that way. Okay, physical therapist, for those of you who are pre-PT, you're going to do a lot of that kind of work with people, kind of understanding the origins of muscle tension and pain. Okay. All right, so that's classical conditioning, which is that paired learning or learning by association. Again, advertisers do that all the time. In operant conditioning, we're going to be looking at what are the consequences after the behavior, and how do the consequences after the behavior shape future behavior or punish future behavior. Okay, and this is where we're going to get into reinforcement and punishment, and I want us to get our terms straight because y'all have got to get this before we can kind of move on and build throughout the semester. So get this in your notes. Reinforcement is any consequence that increases the probability of future behavior or increases behavior. Reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior. So what I don't want you doing is doing synonyms in your head. I don't want you doing like reinforcement good, punishment bad. That it's not a moral judgment here. It's just a description of a consequence that increases behavior for reinforcement or decreases for punishment. Okay, here's where students get confused. So let's see if we can get this nice and clean and nice and straight here. Positive reinforcement. The positive means, and I've got the plus sign here, you're adding something to the environment. Negative, I've got the subtraction sign here, means you're removing something from the environment. So positive means addition, negative means subtraction. Okay. So let's do positive reinforcement. So we're going to imagine we're back in the classroom, and let's say we're in the classroom and I ask, does anybody have any questions? You raise your hand, you ask a question, and as a consequence, here's my response to that question. That's a really good question. And then I answer it. So when I say, that's a really good question, I have added positive reinforcement to that environment. Okay, my previous lecture is saving. Let me just kind of close this out. Let me see if there is a way that I can. I'm going to pause for 1 second here, everybody, because I need to save this. It is taking up a huge part of my screen, but I don't want to lose it. Okay. Okay, I think I can work around it. Okay, so when I say that's a great question, I've added to that environment. And do you think that person might ask future questions, or other students might ask future questions after that consequence? Okay, so that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when we subtract something aversive that ends up increasing behavior. And I'm going to use a seatbelt example. Now keep in mind, modern day seatbelts, they've made the sound when you don't have your seatbelt on rather pleasant. So like modern day sound would be like, let's say you get in, turn on the ignition, and it's going ling ling, ling ling, ling ling, ling ling, and you put your seatbelt on and ling ling goes away. In the olden days, they actually had it better from a behavioral standpoint, where if you got into an older vehicle and you didn't put your safety belt on and you turned on your ignition, you would get something aversive like this. So it's like, okay, I've turned on my car. Okay. By putting on that safety belt, I have subtracted that really aversive sound of, does that make some sense? And then after you've experienced that once, the next day that behavior has now been negatively reinforced, you're going to get in that car and do what before you turn on the ignition?
Put on my seatbelt.
You got it. Okay. You have reinforced that seatbelt behavior by removing that aversive sound. And now it's going to become habit. You're going to do it all the time. Put that safety belt on before you turn on the ignition. Okay. So both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement increase behavior, but positive does it by an addition to the environment. Negative does it by subtracting from the environment. Okay, I want to tell you about a really common human experience that we have associated with anxiety. When we go into a situation and we have overwhelming anxiety, we escape that situation. So it's like, oh, and then we remove ourselves from that situation. We subtract ourselves from that anxious situation, but something has been reinforced. What just got reinforced? Let's say I'm afraid of dogs.
Yeah.
And I'm walking down the street and this big dog comes running up to me and I'm like, ah, big dog. And I go run away or I go jump in my car. What has now been reinforced? I have subtracted myself from being present around that dog. What just got reinforced?
The idea of running away? Like running away from
actually, the fear of the dog. The fear of the dog has now increased. If let's say I'm walking down the street, I'm kind of afraid of dogs because maybe I got bit when I was younger. And I'm walking down the street, this big dog comes running at me and I endure it. And then I'm like, oh, puppy. And I get down to pet the dog and he wants to give me kisses. It's like, oh, this is a nice dog. My fear, if I expose myself to that thing I'm fearful of, as long as it goes well, assuming this dog doesn't attack me, right? Now my fear of dogs has decreased. So I want you to know that so frequently in human emotion, we get into a situation where we feel anxious, stressed, uncomfortable. And if we escape, we subtract ourselves from that situation, that original anxiety builds and gets stronger. And this happens to human beings all the time. Anxiety doesn't start out being totally overwhelming all at once, usually, unless we have a traumatic event. It starts out little, but our avoidance behavior, we avoid, avoid, avoid. That's negative reinforcement, negative reinforcement, negative reinforcement. And that fear or that anxiety grows bigger and bigger and bigger. That makes some sense? We're going to talk about that a little more throughout the semester. So any questions on reinforcement? All right, punishment. So punishment is going to decrease probability of behavior. Same thing, positive, we are adding to the environment. Negative, we are removing from the environment. So let's say you have had an injury. You physical therapists are going to deal with this. You've had an injury and it made some sense to you, let's say to your arm, and you had it in a splint for a while and the doctor said, don't move your arm, you know, make it heal, let it heal. And then let's say the doctor says you no longer need to wear the splint, but you're walking around and you're afraid of moving your arm because if you move it, it hurts. And if you move it and it hurts, you might stop moving it. Does that make some sense? So the pain is the addition to the movement that might make you keep that real still. And you physical therapists are going to know this because you're going to get in there and you're going to help people regain strength, regain their flexibility, that type of stuff. Because when it hurts to move, people stop moving. It gets positively punished. Does that make some sense? Okay. Negative punishment I don't know how many of you, when you were growing up, if you had to do timeout, if timeout was your punishment for bad behavior when you're a kid. And timeout is assuming, like, let's say you're misbehaving. You're misbehaving around your siblings. Let's say you're misbehaving in preschool, that kind of thing. The assumption is you're misbehaving probably because you're getting reinforced for it, okay? And so what timeout is like, let's say your teacher has said, you know, stop jumping up and down. You're like jumping up and down. The kids are laughing at you and you're jumping up and down. They're laughing at you. And it becomes more, they start jumping up and down. Everybody's jumping up and down, having a preschool party. The teacher's like, I told you to stop jumping up and down. I'm going to put you in the timeout chair. And then you go to this really boring timeout chair and you have been negatively punished. And then when you get to go back into the classroom with your friends, you're less likely to be jumping up and down now. Make sense? Make sense how timeout? Okay. So again, both of these are going to be punishing unwanted behavior, but the positive is addition and the negative is removing. Questions? Okay, keep thinking about this and keep coming up with your own examples. And then if you have any examples that you kind of you're struggling with, email me. We can Zoom meet in an individual meeting, or I can answer during an email. But I really want you all to absorb this because we're going to be building on this all throughout the semester. Okay. What I also want you to know is that, so we've talked about these reinforcers and punishers, but I also want you to know that even though that's operant conditioning, that we can classically condition reinforcers and punishers. So I want to give you an example. And keep in mind that anything that affects us on a physiological level is primary punishment or primary reinforcement. So let's say that we are thirsty. Water is going to be what? If we are thirsty and we have water, that is going to serve as what? Reinforcement, punishment, primary, secondary?
Positive reinforcement.
It's going to be positive reinforcement at the primary level. Because if we are having this physiological need and we have water, that's going to be primary positive reinforcement, but at the primary level because it's satisfying that thirst. It's satisfying that physiological need. Got it? Okay. I am thirsty. I don't have water, but I have a dollar bill. And I give that dollar bill to a person at a convenience center. That dollar bill is secondary reinforcement. That dollar bill is classically conditioned to me being able to buy my water. I drink the water. That's primary reinforcement. So does that make sense? The dollar bill is secondary reinforcement. And then here's where people get into trouble. Credit cards. Okay, so I've got credit card here. Credit card would be considered tertiary and beyond classically conditioned to meeting a physiological need. So I don't have a dollar bill, but I'm thirsty. So I take my credit card, I go to the convenience center, I swipe it, I get my water, I drink the water. But can you see, I want you to, let's back up here for a second. Can you see how credit cards get so far removed from real money? It almost starts to feel like monopoly money, which is why people get in trouble with their credit cards at times. So it might be like, I want this thing, but I don't have the dollars to buy this thing, but I've got this piece of plastic where I can swipe it and get that thing. And it gets so abstract that the actual amount that gets owed can grow very easily for a lot of people. That makes some sense? I had a friend in graduate school. I look back on this and it's like, oh my gosh, I bet you he's in poverty now. He put his entire graduate school tuition on a credit card. That's very, very expensive interest. Okay, so does it make sense? So primary is affecting us on a physiological level. Secondary is classically conditioned to the primary. Tertiary is classically conditioned to the secondary. Does that make sense? If someone were to punch us in the face, I don't want this happening to anybody in class, but if someone were to punch us in the face, what would that be?
Positive punishment?
You got it. At the primary level. Yeah, positive punishment at the primary level because it's affecting us directly on an anatomical physiological level. You got it. Yeah. In the the shock experiments. I'm totally brought Milgram. In Milgram, they would push a button and then ostensibly shock somebody, but the button was at the secondary punishing level and a little bit easier for people to do. Like they would never, even in the Milgram experiment, take a live wire and go shock somebody, but it was easy to push a button thinking they were shocking somebody, and then they would hear somebody going, ah, yelling in the next room. They weren't really getting shocked. They were just pretending to.
So would that example be a secondary or tertiary level?
Pushing the button to shock somebody would be secondary.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. But actually taking a live wire and poking
primary.
Yeah. Like a taser. That would be primary. Yeah.
So what would be a tertiary example of that? If there is one.
I guess tertiary would be, let's say somebody is planning to protest and be violent. Tertiary might be egging them on in some way, egging them on in a tweet or on Facebook, or egging them on in a text message, something like that. So a little farther removed from the actual physical force.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions here before we move on after reinforcement and punishment? All right. Okay. So in behaviorism, the environment conditions the learned behavior. And one way that we can think of in behaviorism, if we knew somebody's entire classical operant conditioning, we could explain their behavior through that conditioning process. But what we normally do when we're doing behavioral therapy is that we get to understand the problem behavior, and then we can use our operant conditioning and our classical conditioning to learn a different behavior or undo learned behavior. Okay, so we call this behavior modification or behavior therapy. It's just when we're pulling together this knowledge and we're using it to help people change their behavior. And so we've talked about the self-monitoring already a bit this class, helping people create logs. Again, nowadays, a lot of people will use a phone app instead of recording it on paper and pencil, but keeping track of behavior that they're trying to change. And then it's really helpful if you have them record when they do the behavior, where they're doing the behavior, what are the emotions involved with it, what are the automatic thoughts involved with it. And that allows us to see the antecedents, which would be the stimuli that spur behavior. And then that allows us to see the consequences, which would be, are they getting reinforced or are they getting punished as a consequence to the behavior? And this is where, I don't have this on the slide, but get ABCs in your notes. So ABCs would be having people record this information so we know the antecedents or the stimuli. The B would be the actual behavior, like smoke a cigarette. And then the consequences would be, are they reinforced or punished? So let's say it's 3 o'clock, it's break time. 3 o'clock, the little bell dings. 3 o'clock, it's break time for everybody in the factory. Go outside, smoke a cigarette, feel relaxed and have better concentration as a consequence to that cigarette, which would actually be primary positive reinforcement. So the antecedent would be the time of day, break time. The behavior would be smoke a cigarette. The consequence would be primary positive reinforcement, feeling good after smoking that cigarette. And by doing these self-monitoring, like I said, people get reactants. They get that awareness and they get that automatic reactance. So a lot of times they start changing behavior even without much counseling or much help. But what it also gives us when we are helping people in behavior therapy, it gives us a baseline of their behavior. Like, here's where you were. Like, let's say you were a 2-pack-a-day smoker and you've cut all the way back to 7 cigarettes a day, but you're really struggling to cut back beyond 7 cigarettes a day. You could look back on these old logs and go like, wow, look at how far you've come. You have come such a long way. You are, way like down to 1/10 of what you used to smoke, as an example. So we create that baseline. Self-monitoring gives us a lot of information too. So goal setting for behavior change, one of the things that I like to do with clients when they're really struggling, they're thinking about their goals for change, but they're really struggling to actually make the change happen. Come up with their goals and put the goal in writing. So instead of like just think the goal in their head or maybe tell the goal, have them put the goal in writing. And we call that in writing contracting. And it's kind of like when we have a contract that we sign, we take out a car loan and we sign a contract. That's a commitment that we're going to pay off that car loan, as an example, or we're going to make our monthly payments. So putting it in writing is more of a commitment than just thinking it. We want to help people put their goal in commitment language in writing. So imagine, let's say you go to a civil union or you go to a wedding and you've got the couple up front, and imagine whoever's officiating the ceremony going, will, you know, they say da 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 da, and then people do say what? Like, will you take blah, 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 and they say, I will, or I do.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you imagine somebody in a ceremony like that going, I'll give it a good try? Will you? Give it a try. We'll see, right? That's not commitment language, right? So you want people, like, let's say that they are coming up with their goals. Let's say I've got somebody who really wants to start exercising, and I'm asking them, okay, so what kind of exercise do you think you can do? I think I can walk. I can walk briskly in my neighborhood. Okay, tell me, how long are you going to walk briskly? I think I can walk briskly for half an hour. Great. Tell me the days and the times when you are going to go out. You want to go out 3 times this week and walk for 30 minutes? Tell me the days and the times that you intend to go out and start your walk. And then let's say I get somebody, I will walk Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 7:30 in the morning until 8 o'clock in the morning for 30 minutes. Do you think that the person who writes that out in commitment language is a lot more likely to do the exercise than the person who goes, I'll try to walk some this week? Make some sense? And so we coach them. We coach them in this kind of stuff. What we also want to do is, let's say they've got a long-term goal. Let's say you've got somebody really ambitious here. They want to run a marathon. They want to run 26 miles. Nobody goes out and just goes from couch potato to running 26 miles. So what you would do here is, if that's the goal, and let's say there's the deadline for the marathon, you would help them develop short-term goals. So let's say it's between now and marathon date, and you do half of the time between now and the marathon. By the half date, how many miles should they be running?
14, 15.
Yeah, about half the marathon. You got it. Yeah. So by the half date, they should be running that. By the quarter date, 7, 8 miles, right? So you're helping them. We know that people who achieve long-term goals, they automatically do that. They take these long-term goals and they back up, and they create these short-term goals to shape their behavior to meet those long-term goals. Okay. Some people do that naturally. Some people have to be coached on how to do that. Okay. So in writing, in commitment language, longer term goals, short term goals. We want to also make them behavioral goals. Like I've talked about behavioral contracting, which is kind of the writing, but the behavioral goals. So let's say you've got a client that comes to you and says, I want to lose 30 pounds. Losing 30 pounds is not a behavior. It's a consequence. And so behaviorally, if I'm working with that person that wants to lose 30 pounds, what I'm going to do is get them into some exercise behavioral goals. I'm going to get them into some eating differently behavioral goals, whether they're cutting back on fat, they're cutting back on calories, they're cutting back on portions. So I'm going to get them into exercise behavioral goals and eating behavioral goals. And then as a consequence, they might be losing weight. Does that make sense? But weight loss is not a behavior. Y'all got that? So again, if that person comes to you for weight loss, you're going to be shaping behavior change for them, hoping that as a consequence, they lose weight. Now, let's come down here. We want the goals to be realistic. So if they say, I want a marathon, you don't go, tomorrow, go run 26 miles. Good luck. We don't want them to do that. Actually, if they did that, if they went out, let's say they could endure without killing themselves. If they could run 26 miles from couch potato, how are they going to feel the next day? Are they going to be able to move?
Awful. Yeah, they're going to be feeling awful.
Yeah, that's positive primary punishment. Yeah, we did this really steep hike yesterday, and every time I stand up out of my chair today, my hips are like, whoa, man, I'm feeling that hike. And we stopped at the right, we did the right length. We had bigger ambitions, but I'm glad we stopped at where we did. Because yeah, it's sort of a good sore. But if I absolutely couldn't move, like you told me to run a marathon, I ran a marathon. Now I feel like crap. I'm not going to want to run anymore. I've been punished. Got it? So you want the goals to be realistic. You want them to be slightly challenging so somebody's not bored, but you also want it to be realistic, and you want to start small and build. Okay. So the person who wants to run a marathon, let's say they haven't done any running or any jogging, you might get them walking first, and then walking a certain distance, and then trying to jog walk that distance, and then trying to run that distance, and then bump it up a little more, and then bump it up a little more. Does that make sense? Because you don't want them to be so punished that they quit. And that's the very common thing that people do. People get New Year's resolutions. They join gyms in January. They go crazy in the gym, and then they're hurting so bad. They're like, this can't be good for me. I feel like crap. And then they quit. Any questions about goal setting? Okay.
Yeah, could you talk about behavioral contracting again? Because I don't see the difference between that and like the in-writing contracting.
Okay. Well, the in writing is a behavioral contract, but let's use an example of a family. Let's say you've got a family and they're having difficulty with their children's behavior. And so let's say they sit down and they start to create this big, long behavioral contract. And on the contract is each child's name and each child, the chores that each child is supposed to be doing, and is it daily, every other day, whatever, each of the chores. And then let's say this is happening to a lot of parents who are homeschooling their kids. What are your homework and your school goals every day? And then they would lay out on the contract each child's name, each of the chores, each of the schoolwork, and then what will be your reinforcer if you do your chores and your schoolwork. Maybe there's a monetary allowance that gets delivered on Saturday. And then what would be if you don't do your chores and you don't do your schoolwork, what would be your punishment? And maybe it would be for every day that you don't do your chores, you lose your screen time in the evening. Like you're not allowed on the computer, you're not allowed on your iPad, phone, whatever. Does that make sense? And then the behavioral contracting would be you have parents sign and you have each kid sign by their name and their specific contract. And then that might go in a very public place. When I've worked with families and I've done this kind of stuff, the contract maybe goes up on the refrigerator in the kitchen. So if there's ever a time of like, have you done your chores today? Do I need to remind you of the contract on the refrigerator? Do you need to go take a look at it again? That kind of thing, and just sort of remind everybody. Yeah. So somewhere in here, it's just a subtle difference. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Contingency management. This is one of those things where I have learned when working with clients, it seems very easy for us to understand. It's very challenging sometimes for them to understand. But the contingency is setting up the contingency or the reinforcer or the punishment, but it's set up if and only if there is the wanted behavior. So let me tell you an example where contingency management went wrong, and then we'll talk about where it can be done well. So when I was working in weight management, I was sitting down with a woman, and she had laid out all of her exercise goals, all of her eating goals for the week. And we were talking about, okay, how are you going to reinforce yourself if you meet all of your behavioral goals this week? And she said, oh, well, there's this new George Clooney movie coming out soon. I'm a Clooney fan. And she's like, me and my girlfriend, we're going to go see this George Clooney film this weekend, and that'll be my reinforcer. And then I was like, wait a minute. Are you only going to go to that and see that movie if you meet all of your exercise goals, if you meet all of your dietary goals? Are you going to go see that movie with your friend no matter what? She was like, oh, yeah, me and my friend, we're going to go see that movie no matter what. That's not contingent on the behavior, okay? That if she did not meet her behavioral goals, she should not allow herself to go see that movie. That would be the punisher for not meeting the behavioral goals. Does that make sense? So that if and only if is hard for people to understand. time. I was working with a mom with a child who was pre-diabetic and was quite overweight. And we were working on all of these exercise goals and nutrition goals for the week. And I was just sitting there with the mom, and we had laid all of this stuff out. And I was like, okay, what kind of reinforcer are you going to give to your son if and only if he meets all of his behavioral goals this week? And guess what mom came up with? And I had to backtrack with mom. She's like, oh, I'll take him to McDonald's, let him order anything he wants. And I was like, no, not inappropriate. We are not going to use food as reinforcer for a program that is involving working on food, right? And then second of all, what she needed to come up with was a non-food reinforcer of like, okay, if he meets all of his exercise goals and he meets all of his food goals for the week, we'll go to the zoo, or we'll go to the Humane Society and play with the puppies and the kitties, something like that. So if and only if, and you can even record these on the log. So when I worked in weight management, we would set up behavioral goals, and then we would record what would be the contingent reinforcer or the contingent punisher at the end of the week, depending on if the goals were met or not. Stimulus control. Okay, this triggers or antecedents would be the synonyms for stimuli. And I've got a picture of a stoplight here because a stoplight is a really good example of stimulus control for driving behavior. Okay, so the light's red, you stop. Light's green, we all go. Light's yellow, you floor it if nobody's in front of you, right? Yellow lights bring out our personality. Yeah, but my point here is most people know to stop at a red light. Most people know to go at a green light, and then people make decisions depending on, what room they've got in a yellow light. It is a very effective stimulus control. It keeps us from crashing into each other at all kinds of different intersections all over the place when we are driving. Okay, it's very effective. So what I'm talking about here with human behavior is if we've got stimuli in our environment that is creating unhealthy behavior, we need to change that. So I talked about the cookie jar, the transparent cookie jar, screaming your name in your kitchen. Get rid of that. We want to manipulate and add good stimuli. So this might be, I've even heard people, I'm not much of a gym goer. I've got kind of like personal gym in my home, and I like working out at home, which is great. The pandemic. But I've known people who go to gyms, even talk about if they don't feel like working out that day, they'll just like go to the gym, log in, make themselves get in there. And then it's like, well, I'm here, I might as well do something. And then they get to going on the exercise equipment, and then they get their workout in. But that would be just like making yourself go inside the gym would be stimulus control. If you're not going to like go inside the gym and just stand there in the doorway the whole time, that'd be silly, right? So just going inside of the gym is stimulus to get to working out, as an example. So we want to manipulate this stuff, and we want to use it. Some other strategies, we've talked about the competing behaviors already. That would be the butt naked on the toilet seat so as not to be putting food in one's mouth. But I do want to talk about pre-mac. Pre-mac, some of you might automatically do this, and actually people who are usually very disciplined are doing pre-mac even though they don't even know they're doing it. Pre-mac would be where you make yourself do a less enjoyable behavior, and then you reward yourself, reinforce yourself with a more enjoyable behavior. So in my academic career, where I feel like I have to work the hardest is grading papers. I like reading students' papers and what they've researched. It's fun, but it takes a lot of concentration to grade a paper. So I'll do this little game. I'll pre-mac my way through my grading period where it's like, okay, I grade 2 papers, I go eat a meal. I grade 3 papers, I go out for a run. I grade 1 more paper, I go play with my dog, play fetch with my dog. You get in the picture? And I don't know if you all had the experience where you're in trouble when you're making yourself do certain like schoolwork, where it's like grade a paper, go clean your bathroom, like that's reinforcing, but it's like, well, at least I'm cleaning my bathroom and I have a clean bathroom, and for 5 minutes there I wasn't grading a paper kind of thing. But does that make sense? Do some of you do this? Show of hands if you do some of this. Like make yourself do something. Yeah. It's a great way of pre-macking your way through nice discipline in this world. So glad to hear y'all are doing this. Okay, so when we do systematic behavior modification or behavior therapy, we're pulling all this stuff together. We're just pulling it all together into programmatic change for people. Again, if we've been recording the data on those self-monitoring forms, we've got sort of this history of data and progress over time, which can be really great for clients. So now I'm going to move into the behaviorism says that the environment has to happen for behavior to get learned. But in social learning theory, I'm actually more of a social learning theories type of therapist because I do cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy. Bandura developed this, and there's some other names attached to it, Julian Roeder, Walter Mischel. They say that not only does the environment affect behavior, but the person also affects the environment, and there's bidirectional influence. So a good example of nice bidirectional influence is if you've picked a major that's going to lead to a career that you're excited about doing that career, it's going to get you out of bed every morning to go to your career, that is a nice person environment fit. If on the other hand, let's say you're in a major that somebody wants you to be in, or imagine you've got a friend who's doing an obligatory major because their parents want them in that major, but they don't enjoy the major, they can't imagine being happy in a career that major is going to lead to, that's a very poor person environment fit. Okay. And Bandura came up with these two cognitive variables. We've already talked about self-efficacy today, but self-efficacy is your belief in whether or not you can do a behavior. And the way that you get to that belief that you can confidently do a behavior is you have shaped and learned, particularly a complex behavior, you have shaped and learned how to do that very complex behavior. And then once you've got it, you've got it. I've been watching Masterclass, which is a subscription to all of these famous people and how they got to being really successful in their careers. And I watched Simone Biles a couple of weeks ago, and she did such a wonderful, she's the gymnast that flies and has done things that nobody else has ever done. And she was so good at walking the audience through, and she had a couple of little gals showing different skills, how you shape these really, really complex gymnast moves by starting here and mastering the skill, and then moving that skill forward and mastering that skill, and moving that skill forward and mastering that skill. And it was just a wonderful way of sort of going, oh, that's how gymnasts learn how to do that. The outcome expectancy is if we do a behavior, do we think we will get reinforced or do we think we will get punished for that behavior? And we are a lot more likely to do a behavior if we have the self-efficacy and we anticipate reinforcement. So a lot of times people know how to do behaviors, but they don't do certain behaviors because they really are fearful that they're going to get punished for doing that behavior. Okay, so as psychologists, we get in there and we sort of take a look at their efficacy and their outcome expectancy. So the Bobo doll studies was a great example of showing that people could learn without getting their own reinforcement, their own punishment. People could learn by just watching others get reinforced or getting punished. And in the classic Bobo doll study, this was Albert Bandura. He's got this playroom and he's got these Bobo dolls. Bobo dolls are boring. Nobody plays with these anymore today. But they were this blow up thing that had a weight in the bottom. And if you knocked it over, woo, exciting, it would just pop back up. And the behavior that they had kids watch was another kid go into the playroom and do a very brand new behavior. And the brand new behavior was they took a mallet, they would whack the Bobo doll, it would bounce down and bounce back up. And then the kid would either get reinforced or punished for doing that brand new behavior by an adult. So either the kid would go in the room, whack the Bobo doll with the mallet, the Bobo doll would go boop, boop, and the adult in the room would go, ha, that looks like fun, do it again. And then the kid's gonna do it again. Or let's say the kid goes in, they take the mallet, they whack the Bobo doll, and the Bobo doll does its thing. And the adult in the room is like, no, we don't even hit toys with the mallet. That's dangerous, give me that. So they got punished. And then the dependent variable was then they would have these kids watching this all go down. Then the kid got to go into the room, and basically the kid would go whack the Bobo doll with the mallet and laugh if they saw the previous kid get reinforced for that brand new behavior. If they saw the previous kid do that brand new behavior and get punished, they would go into that playroom and they were a lot less likely to do that behavior. they observed that the outcome expectancy of I can get reinforced or I can get punished by watching another kid. Okay. And so this is all about modeling behavior. And I want us to think a little bit about like modeling exercise equipment. One of my colleagues in graduate school, she does a lot of going into nursing homes and taking exercise equipment and getting older people to learn how to use the equipment. And I get fascinated with exercise equipment advertisements because they're a hoot. They're not trying to teach you how to use the equipment. They just want you to buy their equipment. Okay. So the Peloton ads are always in front of these, $1 million views. You get these women on these commercials where they, their hair and makeup, their exercise clothing actually matches. Mine never matches, their hair and clothes, and they're in there just like, and they're just doing the equipment, and it's like, they're looking beautiful and they're not perspiring at all. They're just modeling. If you buy this equipment, you might look like me, is what they're kind of trying to do. And that wouldn't work. Imagine you go into a nursing home. Here's what you'd have to do. So let's say you've got some kind of fancy, equipment where people, and you ask for a volunteer in the audience, and let's say Irv volunteers, and Irv gets up there on the equipment, and you get Irv's hands in the right place, and you get his feet in the right place, and then you start the machine going really slowly, and Irv's kind of like, whoa, and then over time, like, Irv's like, oh, I think I got it. You can make it go a little faster. It's like, here's how you make it. And then Irv's up there like, oh, wow, okay, well, this is really hard to get used to, but now that I've got it, I've got it. And then you're like, Irv, great job showing everybody how to use it. Who wants to come up next? Sally. Okay, Sally, you come up, and let's get you started on. You would actually, in real modeling, you would show people fumbling, and you would show people not knowing how to do it perfectly like you see in those advertisements. You would show people learning how to learn how to do it. And then that's going to give other people, like if I saw Irv struggle and now I get up there and I struggle, no shame in that, because I just saw somebody do that too. Make some sense? So normally when we're modeling, again, not like advertising is just trying to get you to buy their stuff, we actually show people that. And we want to get in there and we want to shape behavior. And I want to give you the 80-20 rule. This goes for teachers. This goes for coaches. This goes for healthcare providers. 80-20, 80% of the time you want to be delivering reinforcement because you want people to keep learning that behavior. 20% or less of the time you want to be giving critique. Or even in the dog training world, they even call it a correction now. They don't even call it a punisher, they call it a correction. And so if I'm trying to teach somebody this skill of like, let's say I'm teaching them a yoga pose and they're starting from the scratch, I might be like, oh, hey, wow, oh, you've really got that. Okay, I want you to twist your pelvis a little bit this way. There you go. Give it a try again. All right, isn't that better? Hey, you're getting it. Lots and lots, 80% reinforcement, 20% critique or correction. And again, just like the motivational interviewing, I want you to think about what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. If people are giving you lots of reinforcement, you're going to keep being motivated to keep learning. But of course, nobody's going to start with a new skill and do it perfectly. You're going to have feedback or critique, or in the dog training world, correction. Okay, 80-20 makes sense? Cool. Okay. What I also like about the social learning theory is that we can regulate our own behavior. We can learn how to pre-map. We can learn how to give ourselves our own reinforcement, like checking off something on a to-do list. We can give ourselves our own punishment. A lot of times our own punishment is feeling guilty. So like we had this to-do list, we did nothing, feeling guilty. Gonna lay your head down on the pillow tonight and go, I had all this stuff to do and I got zero done. Guilt. That's our own punishment. So I like that self-regulatory, that idea that it kind of gives hope if you're trying to help people learn new skills or get rid of unwanted behavior, it helps provide with that. Okay, social learning theory, person interacts with the environment. Two important person variables are our cognition. And now I want us to think about how our thoughts, remember that cognitive behavioral triangle we talked about? Behavior, thoughts, emotions, that's where we're headed. So let's go and talk about the beginning of cognitive psych. So automatic thoughts, we are always talking to ourselves in our head. But a lot of times they've got that dialogue, they're talking to themselves in their head, but rarely do people, unless you know what you know now, back up and think about what are those automatic thoughts. So you know that place where, especially if you get a yucky song stuck in your head, do y'all know that place in your head where you yucky song, yucky song, yucky song, yucky song, and it's like, it's driving me crazy, yucky song, that type of thing? That's where the tape plays, okay? That's where those automatic thoughts are, and we're always talking to ourselves, and that's normal. Those automatic thoughts are very powerful in driving how we feel. Those automatic thoughts are very powerful in driving our behavior. So the person who's trying to cut back on smoking, who goes, I'm going to die if I don't get a cigarette, they're going to go light up a cigarette. A person who's trying to cut back on their smoking, who's like, I'm going to die if I get it. No, I'm not going to die. That's my mind telling me I'm kind of craving here and I'd kind of like to have a cigarette. I do this one all the time. I get real dramatic when I get hungry. I'm like, I'm starving to death. And it's like, I could last weeks without food before I would starve to death, but that's just me being dramatic about, I'm so hungry, I'm starving. Okay, now I want us to think about our automatic thoughts are like the leaves on a tree. And the leaves on the tree are interacting with the environment. They are absorbing the sunshine to make chlorophyll to keep that tree alive. And that's about the basic botany that I know here. But keep in mind, the leaves are interacting with the environment and the sunshine. At the trunk of the tree is where we form our core beliefs or our core rules for ourselves. And a forester could tell you, they could go out into the forest, cut a tree in half, look at the cross section of the tree, and tell you all about that tree's life. What year was there too much rain? What year was there a drought? What year maybe was there an infestation? What year was maybe there a fire in that forest? They can tell you all about that. And I want us to think about our lives as a tree. We come into this world, this little twig, this little baby, and then we have experience and we form a ring, and we have more experience and we form a ring, development, we form a ring, we form a ring. And then eventually our trunk, our adult-like trunk, is this full tree trunk here. But what I want you to take home from this tree of life is that our core beliefs, our rules for ourselves, our core expectations, our core values usually get laid down by our family members, and they get laid down based on experiences that maybe we've had in school, or maybe experiences we've had in church, or experiences we've had in sports. And those core values and beliefs spring out and form automatic thoughts in the way that we think about things. And it's again, automatic thoughts controlling our feelings and our behavior. So when we get in there and we're working with people, we're going to try to get in touch with those thoughts. Remember, on the self-monitoring logs, we might have, I had a thought, I'm going to die if I don't get a cigarette. And we might be like, whoa, 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 let's talk about that. Let's talk about a different way of thinking when it's 5 o'clock when you normally light up a cigarette, okay? And modify that. To get at the core, here's a little exercise you all can do on your own. If you think about growing up and you think about parents, think about the best thing they ever said or did for you, and think about the worst thing they ever said or did to you. The best thing they ever said or did was probably when you were meeting a family value, you were meeting a family rule, or you were meeting a family expectation. The worst thing parents ever said or did to you was probably where you were breaking a family rule, breaking a family expectation, breaking a family value, as an example. So I think back, and I'm not going to tell you the story, but I think back about the worst thing parents ever said or did to me. And it was when I was in a situation that not only I was not taking responsibility for myself, I was not taking responsibility for somebody else's mistakes. So somebody around me made a mistake and I got in trouble for somebody else's mistake. And the life lesson that I learned, the value that I took from that, is not only be responsible for yourself, you better be responsible for yourself, but you also better be responsible for the people around you. And look who became a psychologist, folks. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's that kind of stuff. So you can kind of think about that on your own and get an idea of where that takes you. Not gonna work. Okay. So these ways that we think, these automatic thoughts, there are some common ways that we make distortions or errors, or sometimes these are called dysfunctional thoughts. And so let's take a look at some of these these patterns that people get into that get them into trouble. You all are going to be able to relate to this. So let's start with mind reading. So with mind reading, we tend to assume what other people think instead of inviting communication about what they're thinking or feeling. And you all know the words assume. When you assume, you make an ass of you and me. Okay. And so this is such a common thing that people who are close to one another do. They think they know each other so well, they make assumptions instead of asking. And it's those assumptions, this is like at the core of most human conflict. It's like misunderstandings, misassumptions, and mind reading, okay? And so that's something we can all kind of practice and try to do better, of asking people what is their opinion, what do they want to do, and not necessarily assume, as an example. Okay. All or none thinking, this is called black or white, all or none thinking. And this is when people kind of have these rigid ways of thinking there is a right way to do something or a wrong way to do something, or a right way to be or a wrong way to be. When actually a lot of the world kind of exists in the gray area. You think about that normal bell curve, you know, rarely is somebody very low on IQ, very high on IQ. Most of us are kind of somewhere in the middle on IQ, as well as all kinds of other personality traits. All right, I realize our time, so let me get through one more and then we will call it a day. Overgeneralizing. Overgeneralizing is when we take usually one bad event and we generalize it across other domains. So as an example, I saw a young woman years ago when I was doing some postdoc hours at our counseling center at ASU, and she came in to see me, and I asked her, I said, like, why have you decided to come in and see me today? And she said, well, I'm here because I'm a failure. I was like, okay, why don't you tell me how you've come to a conclusion that you're a failure? Well, I failed last semester. Okay, tell me about last semester and what happened last semester. Well, I actually got A's and B's in all my classes, but I failed my math class. And I was like, okay. So you legitimately failed a math class, but you had a passing GPA because your other grades in your other classes were good. And then somehow you started out and you said, you told me you failed last semester and you're a failure as a person. Like, whoa, wait a minute. Let's backtrack. Again, maybe you're not meant to be a mathematician, girl. And she wasn't. But it was that kind of thing of sort of taking, like, she grew up with the family expectation, you should never, ever, ever fail at anything. Okay. And so that's where she had drawn that overgeneralized conclusion that because she failed a class, she failed a semester, she's a failure as a person. And we had to just sort of help her compartmentalize that and realize that, okay, maybe math's not a major for you, but life can go on. Any questions about anything we've covered? We got a bunch more of these cognitive distortions, and we've got ACT to talk about. And we'll do that first thing in class tomorrow. But any questions before we conclude today?
Yeah, could you go over the self-regulatory model real fast?
The self-regulatory, instead of thinking the environment or somebody else is going to reinforce or punish you, that's when you create your own reinforcers and punishers. So that would be like creating that daily to-do list and then, you know, giving yourself a little woo when you finish something on that list. That would be you giving yourself reinforcement for doing something on the to-do list. And it's a way of managing and regulating your own behavior. So meaning it doesn't have to be done to you, you can do it to you and regulate yourself. Good question. Others? All righty. Okay, we'll keep doing the cognitive distortions and we'll do ACT tomorrow, and then we will start the epidemiology lecture, probably second half tomorrow. Okay, bye everybody. Good to see you. Take care.